My work was enhanced by the acquisition of a tractor-powered machine that was capable of digging trenches up to 80 centimeters deep and 500 meters long in one night. Throughout the hours of daylight, we remained engaged in poring over and developing plans for additional defences. And during the hours of darkness, when we could work without the danger of the ever-present fighter bombers, we constructed miles of bunkers and earthworks in anticipation of a final massive Soviet push through our lines to the Baltic. Our work was interrupted abruptly in mid-December by a deep, sudden frost. The earth froze to the consistency of stone. The muddy roads were once again passable, and a forbidding atmosphere of expectation swept over the ragged army. The companies far in the front and the artillery observers reported the sound of heavy movements of vehicles coming from within the enemy lines. Throughout the nights, the grinding of tank tracks was clearly audible. Our artillery remained powerless to fire on targets of opportunity, as munitions had become scarce and were carefully rationed. Bands of fighter planes and squadrons of bombers displaying the red five-pointed star on their fuselages and wings flew over us at random. With impunity, they made daily excursions during these clear, frost-laden December days on their way to bomb the supply harbours of Libau and Windau in attempts to disrupt our tenuous lifelines. The flak units and the few fighters remaining with the army group battled valiantly against the endless numbers of enemy aircraft. Our fighter squadrons were commanded by Luftwaffe General Pflugbeil, and during 15 and the 16th of December alone, they shot down 25 Soviet planes over Courland. To better enable me to fulfill my assignment for constructing and planning the defences, I was invited by the regimental medical officer of the 438th Regiment, Dr. Schlipp, to share the Latvian farmhouse he occupied. 2 women and an elderly man continued to inhabit part of the dwelling, and the younger of the women, the daughter, spoke fairly good German. When asked why they did not take refuge farther toward the rear to seek safety from the daily artillery barrages, they replied, "To where? There no home more, only the sea." They heated the washroom for us and fried potatoes, while the old man chopped wood in a nearby shed, and he was once observed tacking the skin of a marten to a board. He had thus spent his entire lifetime here on this land. He once remarked, "We Latvians now have the dogs in our land, but soon we will have to have the wolves as friends." The meaning of his words required no explanation. We had nicknamed the doctor Poldi, and his work was never ending. Legions of wounded were brought to him in pony carts lying on scattered straw, often under the protection of darkness. They were wrapped in dirty, blood-encrusted bandages, weak, unshaven and filthy, without hope or barely retaining a glowing ember of optimism. Poldi would take them under his care, and beneath the uncertain protection of the Red Cross flag, he cared for the wounds, replacing bandages, administering pain-relieving injections, stitching torn flesh and splinting broken bones. The serious cases would be loaded into the Sankas to be driven to the division collection point a few kilometres behind the front for surgery. These assistants to the beaten and weary, the doctors and medical corpsmen who wore the staff of Caduceus on their shoulders and carried the scalpel in their tunic pocket, were to prove themselves indispensable many times in the future during the period of imprisonment in Russia. Poldi and I shared many thoughtful conversations in his hut. I would appear in the dead of night from my work constructing the defences, and would sit next to the hearth near the warmth of the fire. In the flickering light, he and his medical assistant would join me and drink a toast to my safe return. Here existed warmth and comfort, a part of home that exuded not only from the hearth, but also from the heart. Poldi was a dark-haired, very serious doctor with deep brown eyes. I often imagined him a descendant of the Roman or Gallic legionnaires who occupied the area of Castel Mainz, which he called home. We would speak of our homes often and would ask ourselves if we would ever again stand before the ancient monuments of our homeland, if we would ever again step into the half-darkness of the Mainz cathedral to pray. Always again the spectre of our fate would rise to loom over us and would surface during each conversation. How would it all end? Would the army in Courland be sacrificed to the overwhelming onslaught of communism bolstered by the immense industrial might of the combined Allied powers. Would it be later said over our graves, as was said following the Stalingrad debacle, that the Courland army had fulfilled its true duty to its country and people to the last round, fighting against overwhelming odds to allow new defences to be established, making it possible to protect the homeland? The fate of the troops who were eventually isolated and abandoned far to the south on the Crimean Peninsula, our former battleground, came to mind. It was said that as boats and ferries plunged towards the open sea on a course toward Odessa, the remaining defenders who were left behind had called to the departing vessels, "We are the honorary citizens of the nation." They then marched the long, bitter way into captivity. A few days before the expected offensive, a new medical bunker was prepared near the regimental headquarters, enabling the wounded to be brought to a safe area for care. The Latvian farmhouse at Stedini, where Poldi and I had enjoyed temporary comfort, was later riddled by tank fire. We saw no more of its inhabitants and never learned of their fate. A solid, passable road led through a sector of the division from the direction of Pampali towards Stedini, then split into a fork. One branch led northeast toward Frauenburg, the other toward Libau. It was at this junction that the Russians attempted to break through in order to split the Courland army and to capture Libau. At exactly 0600 on the 21st of December 1944, our sector of the division was enveloped in a firestorm. The horizon came alive, glowing with the muzzle flashes from countless heavy guns. It was confirmed that within the sector of Grenadier Regiment 438 alone, more than 800 barrels, consisting of a deadly combination of heavy artillery, rockets and mortars, fired multiple salvos on our positions. An incredible raging firestorm rained on the trenches. Machine gun nests, earthworks, bunkers, and reinforced fire positions along our front collapsed in clouds of dust and smoke. The earth trembled, roared, heaved, and tossed. The bunkers collapsed, the trenches were levelled. For 3 long hours, an unseen, unreachable force assaulted the earth with fury, seeking out our last refuge in the shadow of battle. First, the heavy fire was directed on the foremost positions. It then careened over the Stedini heights, after which it advanced into the wooded area to our rear to descend upon the regimental headquarters. The treetops were splintered, entire trees sailed into the sky, and shells struck the reinforced bunkers, completely enveloping our surroundings. Minutes became an eternity. The first wounded appeared, stumbling and staggering aimlessly, often without helmets, their uniforms covered with blood. Those unable to walk arrived wrapped in shelter quarters, carried by lancers straining against the load. The wounded screamed in agony and thrashed wildly on the ground as they awaited the care of the medical officer. Poldi and his assistants worked feverishly. I attempted to assist them by plastering an airtight bandage to a sucking chest wound. Some of the wounded who remained coherent reported that Ivan had broken through the nearby left sector, and concentrations of tanks piled high with infantry had been sighted. Suddenly, the barrage on our position lifted. In the distance, to our right and left flanks, the shells and rockets continued to fall with indescribable fury. I looked across the makeshift operating table at Poldi and felt the nerves at my neck tingle with anticipation. He glanced up at me from his work, nodded knowingly, then wordlessly resumed repairing the wounds of his patient. The silence in our sector was an ominous sign, which I had experienced in battles past. The Soviet artillery had lifted in our area and was now concentrating on our flanks. We were occupying the corridor through which the enemy armour would attempt to thrust toward our open rear sectors. I dropped the roll of bandages and dashed toward the door of the medical bunker, seizing a carbine along the way. At the entrance, I detected the sound of roaring engines and the screeching of tracked vehicles, accompanied by ear-splitting explosions. Red fighter bombers were overflying the woods, releasing bombs and firing with wing cannons and machine guns. The sound of engines grew louder, and through the rolling thunder of explosions, I recognized the unmistakable grinding of Soviet T-34S. From the ruins of the headquarters, I caught sight of several Lancers running in panic past our location with carbines at their sides. Racing headlong toward the bunker, they collapsed upon the ground with burning lungs, rasping, "Panzer! Panzer!" I dashed outside and immediately stumbled over the splintered branches of large trees that had been torn from the now naked stumps rising vertically in the air. On all sides, shells were bursting, and close to the communications bunker, I came upon my longtime friend, Lieutenant Rech, the son of a rector from Saarbrücken. An exploding tank projectile had torn open his abdomen, and as he sank to his knees, I caught him and lowered him slowly to earth. As I looked into his dying eyes, an intense feeling of rage overcame me, a rage I had known only rarely from previous battles and other deaths. It was a consuming rage without reason that barely recognizes a distinction between enemy and friend. An overwhelming sense of anger that knows no limits. A feeling that reaches far beyond the simple emotions of bravery or fear. Bravery and fear are emotions of the sane and have no place in the suicidal quagmire into which we had been thrust. One felt overcome with the simple, primitive obsession for revenge. Revenge! Revenge! Hammered through my brain. Destroy the attackers. Kill them. Those who have destroyed those close to you. When so many have perished, why should I survive? Better to die now, killing the enemy, than to await the inevitable. I leapt to my feet and charged blindly forward. I became vaguely aware of 2 of Reche's men running alongside me. As we approached the 14th Company headquarters, I observed several members of an anti-tank unit frantically preparing their Panzerfaust stovepipes for close combat. Several of the anti-tank weapons were primed and leaning against the wall next to the door of the bunker. "Come on!" I shouted desperately. "Let's go! Let's go! They're coming!" I seized one of the long grey-green tubes loaded with the blunt, bulbous projectile and lunged through the trees for a distance of approximately 50 paces to the edge of the wood line, toward the sound of the heavily armoured vehicles. The shrill whine of bullets filled the air around me, and exploding shells continued to burst in the treetops, sending white-hot fragments whistling and thudding dully into the earth. Suddenly, at approximately 20 metres distance, I observed through the undergrowth the long barrel of a T-34 moving slowly but steadily forward. Acutely aware that the tank was normally accompanied and supported by at least a platoon of infantry, I backtracked in a long arc through the woods and turned to approach the massive silhouette from concealment. Jumping into an opening in the trees near the huge tank, I knelt with burning lungs between piles of splintered branches, from where, at about 30 paces, I could now clearly see the steel colossus that displayed several large numbers painted next to a red star on the turret. I quickly pulled the safety pin from the Panzerfaust and flipped up the perforated sights. I held my breath in a vain attempt to calm my fluttering pulse. I was aware of my pounding heart throbbing with tension in my throat, and I concentrated on aiming correctly. I centered the quadrant of the sight directly in the middle of the giant red star, bordered with white on the turret. With my last strength of will, I forced myself to remain calm and to hold the sight picture steady against the target, and I slowly but firmly squeezed the trigger. With a loud explosion, a ball of flame erupted behind me from the open breech of the weapon into the woods. The projectile flew forward with a roar, clearly visible to the naked eye, and struck squarely on the turret. The warhead detonated flawlessly, spraying the interior of the heavily armoured vehicle with fire and white-hot shrapnel. Immediately, a large round hatch flew open, and a fine wisp of smoke rose from within the tank, followed only by an overwhelming silence. Pressed tightly against the earth, I observed a second tank, previously unseen, some 50 paces away, crashing through the trees in reverse gear as it backed away from its destroyed attendant. It broke through the tree line into an open field where a company of Russian infantrymen were now lying in view, prone upon the ground. The 2 men who had accompanied me from the Panzerjäger Company destroyed this tank with their weapons, just as I had dispatched the lead vehicle. From the concealment of the tree line, the 2 men and I opened fire with carbines upon the Russian company lying on the frozen ground some 200 metres distant. We exchanged a short burst of fire, and the Russians began to withdraw, pulling their wounded with them. We sank to the ground, physically and psychologically benumbed by the experience. We had successfully repelled a reinforced enemy company, and we were alive. The self-propelled guns of Hauptmann Brandner arrived. One of them received a direct hit while on the road. The other was able to position itself and open fire on the column of oncoming Russian tanks on the heights of Stediny. On the first day of the Battle of Kurland at Stediny, the Russians lost more than 20 tanks to Regiment 438 during the fighting at the tiny crossroads that led to Frauenburg and Liebau. My Panzerfaust had destroyed the lead tank at the head of the assault group, and the second had been knocked out by the 2 men of the 14th Panzerjäger Company. 3 additional tanks were destroyed by other grenadiers in close combat, and the self-propelled gun had accounted for the remainder of those that were left burning and exploding on the battlefield. Thus, on the first day, the spearhead of the attacking force had been broken and a major catastrophe was thwarted. On the 10th of December, Knight's Cross holder Hauptmann Zoll, commander of the 14th Company, Regiment 436, received the assignment to march toward Pampali as battle group commander with a strength of approximately 100 men. It consisted of 2 infantry platoons, 1 heavy machine gun platoon, 1 5-man puck crew, a small number of pioneers, and 1 or 2 forward artillery observers. On the 12th of December, the day remained quiet. The sky remained dark with low-lying clouds as Zoll's battle group began constructing defence positions. They waited expectantly for the Russian attack. Days came and went as they feverishly reinforced their positions. On the 16th of December, heavy artillery fire burst on the earthworks, forcing the Lancers to seek shelter in the narrow trenches and makeshift bunkers. The artillery fire continued sporadically for several days, with barrages impacting without warning, only to lift for several hours before resuming. On the 21st of December, the Russian attack was launched, preceded by heavy artillery fire that rendered all movement impossible. The positions near Pampali were penetrated by the infantry and tank units by midday, and that afternoon the beleaguered Lancers were isolated and surrounded. The numbers of dead and wounded continued to rise, the dead lying in the trenches where they fell, the wounded receiving only cursory care under relentless fire from an overwhelming enemy. Ammunition, medical supplies, and food supplies were quickly exhausted. Radio contact with the regiment or division was no longer possible. The last orders received repeatedly stressed to hold the positions at any cost. The pocket continued to shrink. Facing total annihilation within hours, a breakout and withdrawal to the division was planned. Ammunition for the heavy weapons was expended, and lacking prime mover resources, the guns were to be destroyed and abandoned. Transport for the wounded was quickly organized. Despite all efforts, repeated attempts to contact the division met with failure. Thus, official approval for the withdrawal was lacking. The decision to break out before dawn was made without command from higher authority. Columns formed for the transport of the wounded on sleds or in shelter quarters as makeshift stretchers. The exhausted survivors prepared to break through to our lines. At 0330 on the 22nd of December, the order was given for the evacuation. The columns launched out toward the German lines an hour later to the west of Pampali, through an unoccupied depression and headed in a northerly direction. The ragged column was sparsely scattered, a point element forward, the wounded in the middle, and a rear guard following. Progress was slow but successful, and with no movement noted from the enemy, they gained the German lines. On initial contact with the Army Kurland positions, the point element was taken under fire, having been unable to give the password, but they were quickly recognized as German troops, and at 0700 the main column crossed into friendly lines. The survivors of the battle group had entered a sector occupied by the 2nd Battalion, Infantry Regiment 436, and were quickly taken to the regimental headquarters to be greeted. There, they celebrated a successful escape and were offered the opportunity to receive food and a short rest before being sent into the line. The fighting raged through the end of December. This sixth and last Christmas of the war remained muted and depressing for the troops. Our thoughts were constantly occupied by the tenuous, if not hopeless, situation in which we found ourselves. We received solace only in our numbers and in being with comrades with whom we had shared so many experiences over the weeks, months, and years. On the 24th of December, Christmas Eve, a Fusilier battalion from another division marched toward the line to reinforce the sector, and only the steady rhythm of worn, muddy boots upon the frozen ground could be heard. As the column slowly passed the trenches, above the marching ranks of ragged lancers, the faint sound of "Silent Night, Holy Night" could be detected. There remained no peace on earth. The division had suffered heavy losses in the recent fighting, many soldiers having fallen victim to the Russian artillery batteries and machine guns, and we had been forced to surrender some territory to the Soviets to avoid annihilation. At the end of December, the division was relieved and transferred to a quieter sector south of Libau. The third battle for Courland had become another test of the troops' ability to withstand overwhelming odds, and again we had passed the test, albeit with Pyrrhic success. The official reports of OKW thus cited our last battle of 1944. Army Group Courland has destroyed 513 tanks, 79 field guns, and 145 aircraft. In the centre of the heaviest fighting had been not only our division, but also the 225th North German Infantry Division, which held the area to our left. A total of 20 reinforced enemy divisions was thrown against the thinly held positions of the 24th, 205th, 215th, 290th, and 329th Infantry Divisions and the 31st Volksgrenadier Division. The 912th Army Assault Gun Brigade, a unit of the 12th Panzer Division, and the Schützen Panzerwagen Battalion of the 5th Regiment, led by Hauptmann Gauss, who on many sectors of the front was known simply as the man with the visored cap, were constantly thrown into the counter-attack. Without the reliable reinforcement of the self-propelled guns and the few remaining tanks in the Courland army, the great defensive battles could never have succeeded in holding the enemy at bay. During the second and third battles for Courland, our already weakened division had lost in excess of 1,000 irreplaceable men, killed, wounded, and missing. Knowing that our relatives and others lived in daily terror of the bombs left us with no joy at being home again. We had escaped one inferno only to be thrust into another, a different form of purgatory. Although our personal risk of facing the enemy was slight, we remained powerless to stop the waves of bombers that flew over us with impunity. Here, there was no taking up a Panzerfaust or an assault rifle to repel the enemy. One could only helplessly wait. There was little pleasure in being away from our accustomed environment. While visiting my father, I received an indication of the extent of the evil practices our leaders had brought upon the world. My father, who served as a police official, confided in me his suspicions regarding the fate of citizens deemed undesirable by our brown-clad leaders. He spoke of numerous death certificates for people held in government custody, received in the past months from various agencies, sometimes accompanied by the sparse belongings of the deceased. "It cannot be possible," he confided, "that so many people could die of heart failure. Something is terribly wrong." This observation, coupled with more subtle evidence occasionally detected in our daily lives, revealed crimes committed by the government that could not be denied. I was shocked to see the destruction that had befallen the city of Stuttgart. Accustomed to the sight of burned villages and destroyed facilities on the Eastern Front, I was nevertheless distressed to witness entire population centres reduced to blackened piles of rubble. Hit especially hard during the bombing campaign of September 1944, much of Stuttgart lay in ruins. The residence of the former Württemberg royal family, the new palace, was totally destroyed. From gaping, shattered windows, the once elegant draperies waved softly in the wind that whistled through the blackened ruins. Throughout the city, labour units, consisting of prisoners of war, Hitler youth groups and conscripted foreign workers, toiled to clear streets and facilities of rubble. Signs were posted on buildings and street corners, warning that looters would be shot. Photography of any damage was strictly forbidden, punishable by severe penalty. The city I had known in my youth had disappeared in a hideous pile of ash and debris. I journeyed to the Black Forest town of Dornstetten to visit my grandparents, and was relieved to find that the outlying towns and villages remained relatively untouched by the catastrophe that had befallen the larger cities. Encouraged to visit relatives, I took a commuter train to Molucca. En route, we came under attack by an American fighter bomber, which strafed the length of the slow-moving, defenceless train. The aircraft's weapons disabled the locomotive, which slowly screeched to a stop, steam and smoke pouring in great clouds toward the crystal-clear winter sky. Panic-stricken, the passengers fled from the carriages, seeking shelter in the surrounding terrain as the plane banked, and, with its engine howling, began a second strafing run. I attempted to assist several passengers in their efforts to disembark before throwing myself onto the ground as the plane passed overhead, its machine guns rattling. The low-flying aircraft struck the locomotive again with impunity. Within seconds, the attack was over. I had experienced my first and only direct contact with the American enemy, and that on my home soil. Miraculously, only a small number of passengers suffered minor injuries, and after some hours we were able to continue our journey. In the first days of February, I reported to the General Commando, which had been transferred to Ludwigsburg following the destruction of the headquarters in Stuttgart. It was necessary to report back from leave to the military officials to initiate my return to my unit in Courland. At the front desk in the duty office, I met a Stabsfeldwebel who commented on my decorations. Learning that I was returning from leave and would be reporting back to my division in Courland, he remarked that my experience at the front, particularly in close combat against enemy armour, would be better utilized here. He added that personnel with such experience were being sought to train Hitler Youth members in the use of Panzerfaust weapons in preparation for the impending invasion of Germany by the Western Allies. The idea of training 15- and 16-year-old boys to engage enemy armour made my blood run cold. Regardless of our military situation, I believed sending children to their certain deaths in close combat with shoulder-fired weapons served no purpose and could only be considered murder. This practice would have little effect on stemming an armoured advance by a determined, seasoned enemy. The Stabsfeldwebel must have sensed my outrage, as he added that I could also be needed on the Western Front, where the Anglo-American forces were penetrating the Reich's defences. I inquired about the situation in the east, and he advised that the Soviets had breached the defences at Oderbruch. I insisted that I was needed with my division in Courland, and that I must return to my unit. On the 8th of February, my father accompanied me to the Stuttgart train station, where a young Red Cross worker presented me with a container of coffee before I boarded the train to Berlin. The train took me through a thoroughly destroyed country, with intermittent stops extending the journey to approximately 20 hours. While in Berlin, I narrowly avoided being detained by officials from Wehrkreiskommando 5th and sent to the Upper Rhine front, where replacements were badly needed to stem the American advance. I was also directed to report to the Oder front by other authorities. Determined to return to my division, I refused to comply, driven by a desire to end the war alongside my comrades. At the Anhalter train station, I observed officers and field police stopping all personnel in uniform, carefully inspecting identification papers. Soldiers were being sorted into various groups, standing under guard and awaiting further instructions. Due to my decorations, the military police patrols bypassed me, but a senior SS officer approached, accompanied by several Kettenhunde. He politely but firmly instructed me to report to the city commander's office near Potsdamer Platz. I found the commander's office amid the ruins of central Berlin, the blackened, crumbling walls fading into the night sky. Crowds of soldiers stood in ranks near the headquarters. Officers were observed reporting and departing in confusion as the air was pierced by the wailing of air raid sirens. Through the turmoil, an officer informed me that the Russians were only 70 kilometers from Berlin, having already reached Frankfurt am Oder. I was to be placed in charge of an alarm unit to be dispatched to this front. My papers were returned to me, and I was further instructed to report to a flak centre near the Berlin radio tower and to board a bus outside for transport to that location. As I exited the makeshift headquarters, I noted a dim blue light approximately 50 meters beyond the bus. It read S-Bahn. Striding past the bus without turning my head, I proceeded to the streetcar stop and disappeared into the stairwell leading underground. With a pounding heart, I soon boarded the car to the Berlin suburb of Zehlendorf West, where I located my cousin, Dr. Gertrude Brösamler. Zehlendorf had suffered little damage from the countless bombing raids, and among the imposing villas I spent the night discussing events with my cousin. In the neighbouring house lived the actor Theo Lingen. The following afternoon, Gertrude accompanied me to the Stettiner train station so I could continue my journey back to Kurland. As at the Anhalter station, patrols were methodically inspecting the documents of military personnel. To avoid contact with the Kettenhunde and SS patrols, Gertrude and I walked arm in arm, posing as a romantic couple in the midst of a tearful goodbye, both of us avoiding eye contact with those around us. Mysteriously, the ruse worked. We were not confronted by the authorities. Minutes later, a general accompanied by a Feldwebel arrived, and I instinctively remained by his side, hoping his presence would protect me from the squads of military police. After a while I approached him, saluted and introduced myself. I explained my desire to return to my unit in Kurland and asked if I might stay by his side for a time. "Of course, my son!" he exclaimed. "I understand how important it is for you to return to your comrades." With this, I bid Gertrude farewell, and she quickly left. Secure in my position beside the general, I was no longer delayed by the patrols. As the train began to move, I was invited to remain in the general's coach. He was friendly and introduced himself as General Müller, en route to Danzig to serve as the city's commander. His aide, the Feldwebel who had accompanied him, was with us. The following morning I arrived in Stettin without further incident. Years later I learned that General Müller had been hanged in Danzig after the Soviets captured the city. Upon arrival in Stettin, I took quarters in the Hotel Danziger Hof, which was under administrative control of the German Navy. For several days I enjoyed a rare taste of luxury, confirming the widespread belief that the Navy took special care of military personnel. The food was plentiful, the accommodations comfortable, and in the evenings we were entertained by a theatre group, mainly consisting of attractive young women from Vienna. Despite these luxuries, we could not escape the looming threat of the advancing Russian forces, now only a short distance from the harbour. The city was packed with refugees who had fled from the onslaught of the Red Army. Numerous makeshift military units, consisting of a mixture of individuals drafted from anti-aircraft crews, work brigades, or released from military hospitals, were seen everywhere. Every morning I reported to the Stettin Harbour Control, and after 4 days a convoy was organised to steam to Kurland by way of Danzig. During my final morning en route to the harbour, I observed an elderly man, clothed in a no longer fashionable SA uniform, who had obviously been drafted into the Volkssturm. Bent beneath the weight of a World War I vintage rifle slung across his back, he carried a single Panzerfaust over his shoulder, with which he expected to engage the Soviet army. We had reached the end of our strength. Various fishing boats, a destroyer, torpedo boats, minesweepers, and 2 U-boats constituted the escort that was still at anchor in Danzig. While there, we observed warships openly engaged in gunfire support for the units locked in battle beyond the sight of the ships. As we proceeded outbound, it became necessary for the minesweepers to clear the area, as it was reported that the British had sown the waters during the night with mines. At midday, we broke out onto the open sea near the heights of Memel. The convoy received numerous air attacks from Soviet fighter-bomber squadrons. A bomb damaged the rudder of our ship, which had been a former freighter and was the slowest ship of the convoy. One of the other transports received a vital hit on the starboard side aft, and within 15 minutes the ship had disappeared beneath the dark waves. Only half the soldiers who had embarked on this vessel were pulled from the water and rescued. During my absence, the 4th Battle of Kurland had taken place between the 24th of January and the 3rd of February. My division had not been heavily committed to this battle, as the Soviet drive had occurred in the areas of Prikuln and Schrunden. The men of the 132 Days Infantry Division continued to languish in the positions south of Libau. Except for the enemy's minor probes into our lines and some isolated incidents, our sector had remained relatively quiet during my final trip home of the war. With the onset of February, the weather turned mild and spring-like, with blue skies and sunshine accompanied only by a light frost in the morning hours. The soggy earth within the positions and the streets began to dry, and the roads were soon passable once again for a short period. The idyllic weather soon ended with a warm wind out of the south and west, which brought darkly clouded skies and unending thunderstorms. The soldiers from farming families had predicted a stable frost, as stated in the 100-year calendar for February and March 1945, but even specialists err, and this year nature showed little inclination to follow the calendar. The battle-hardened Courland soldiers, especially those survivors from previous winters farther to the east, where weather is much more severe than near the Baltic, remained in good health. Few illnesses were reported, and those who received light wounds would return as soon as possible to the old caves with their units. The few old men remaining at the front wore silver or gold wound badges pinned to their tunics below their close combat insignia to indicate 5 or more wounds received during the course of our odyssey. The positions south of Libau, where I located my old unit with the 438th Grenadier Regiment, were well constructed. The remainder of the 1st Battalion of Regiment 438, now reduced to little more than a combat group, was situated almost against the Baltic. Positioned in a marshy, low-lying area, the soldiers had constructed a log palisade with a floor of sand that was somewhat higher than the surrounding terrain. Warm bunkers had been constructed up to the very front line, and those who had no iron stove had fabricated chimneys and fireplaces of stone and clay. There remained an abundance of firewood, and the troops preferred to burn split birch, as it created little smoke to betray their location. The men remained cautious about creating any smoke that would disclose their positions to the enemy, but we could observe many columns of smoke daily that revealed the enemy's warm fires in the trenches and forests opposite us. Upon my first inspection of our positions, I noticed that the quarters were more than just comfortably warm. When one entered the bunkers from the cold and damp air outside, it felt as though one had stepped into an oven. The troops found these hothouses suitable and protested loudly when the bunker door or shelter quarter hanging over the entrance was left open to the cold air outside. The loud, vociferous protests usually implied that the soldiers would rather stink than freeze, and I respected their wishes. Our experience in constructing defences on the northern front was put to good use in this sector. It was always interesting to observe how, throughout this war, in which the most modern weapons and equipment were employed by all combatants, the use of primitive systems harkened back to hundreds or even thousands of years in the bunkers and positions that wound through the swamps and woods. The blockhouses and palisades constructed by the troops were similar in appearance to those used on the frontier during the American Indian Wars. Bombs, mortar rounds, and medium-caliber artillery shells that impacted on the flanks or corners of the positions were capable of inflicting some damage, but the core of the fortresses remained intact. Shell splinters and small arms fire usually could not penetrate the thick logs. As a replacement for the now scarce barbed wire, the troops had used pointed stakes and logs in the marshy woods before us as a means of hindering the enemy assault forces. On the 20th of February, the Russians again attacked our positions with reinforced companies. We came under a medium-strength barrage from artillery batteries, Katyusha rockets and mortars that impacted within our positions and in the open fields behind us. The barrages increased through the morning until the explosions reached a steady crescendo. Believing that the deluge of firepower brought upon us would suffice in putting the foremost lines out of action, the riflemen of a Soviet division assaulted our positions, coming forward in masses as the barrage swept over us. In the wooded sector, they advanced to within 20 metres of our positions before drawing our defensive fire. The attackers were met with a deadly crossfire from machine guns and assault rifles, hand grenades and Panzerfausts. Our own artillery opened fire on the Russian positions to the rear of the attackers, and while under fire, I directed the fire from our mortar platoon into the heaviest concentration of fighting. The few men holding the foremost line stood and knelt behind the splintered barricades, shooting into the fleeing brown-clad figures who were now retreating into the swamps and woods. The mortar rounds followed the path of their retreat, and as silence descended on the line, I secured the positions to assess our situation. With a handful of infantrymen, I moved forward between the lines to search the dead scattered before us. As twilight descended, we returned to the safety of our positions, bringing documents and numerous weapons back into our lines. A number of officers were found among the enemy dead, wearing new leather belts and holsters. We retrieved documents from new map cases similar to our own. The uniforms consisted of quilted jackets and pants of excellent quality, and the steel helmets were freshly painted with a new matte surface. We collected a large quantity of pistols and automatic weapons, which revealed 1944 as the year of manufacture. Upon the bodies of the enemy soldiers were found bundles of grenades and Molotov cocktails, with which they had hoped to destroy our defences once the perimeter had been penetrated. Some of the Russian wounded left lying before our positions, who had feigned death or lingered while unconscious, now attempted to make their way back to their lines in the growing darkness. Our posts and reconnaissance patrols brought them back into our lines, and they appeared strong, healthy, and well-fed. Our lancers appeared to be ragged scarecrows in comparison, worn and thin from harsh living conditions, but the morale of the Courland troops remained unshaken. Nevertheless, not a day passed in which skirmishes did not take place, and the enemy forces opposite us continued to grow stronger. Just as our own army had done, the Red Army had previously transferred many units to the East Prussian front, considered an area of higher priority. Now new units appeared to face us on the Baltic. After suffering such a defeat before our positions in this sector, they did not attempt further penetration through our battalion, but continued to probe and test our defences with reconnaissance patrols and isolated artillery fire. Construction continued in the positions, new ones were being built and old ones were reinforced. Little enemy activity was observed, but occasionally a more daring or foolhardy Russian would be shot by our ever-watchful snipers. New and more spectacular latrine rumours continued to surface. Many had heard that Army Group Courland was to be ordered to break out to the south toward East Prussia. Others had learned that we were going to be sent to Libau and Windau, the two supply harbours for Courland, to pull back from prepared withdrawal positions and be taken by ship to Germany. The inevitable questions became more dominant in every conversation. What will become of this? How will it end? Is it to be an endless horror from which there will be no escape? Propaganda Minister Goebbels had effectively ensured that we were all aware of the Americans' proposed Morgenthau Plan. Germany would be splintered, divided into many feudal-like territories, and would become a purely agrarian pasture land, a goat field. The intelligentsia and officers were to be liquidated, it was said. The living standards of the people would become lower than even that of the Russian peasants under the Bolsheviks. Faced with these macabre predictions of what the future held for Germany, the Lancers in the trenches remained resolute in their determination to fight to the very end. Later, on the day of the capitulation, some soldiers and officers chose to take their own lives rather than face this bleak future without hope. The cities and villages of the homeland sank under a hail of bombs into soot and ashes. Tens of thousands of refugees from eastern Germany and East Prussia poured into the endless, tearful columns of masses fleeing towards the west before the onslaught of the Soviet army pushing relentlessly toward Berlin. With the beginning of 1945, the situation continued to deteriorate from week to week. The army in Courland remained fast in the grip of an enemy whose resources in men and material were overwhelmingly superior and growing constantly stronger. The troops in the forward positions, as well as those in the rear echelons, were fully aware of the now hopeless situation. They had come to know well this enemy that threatened to overwhelm them, and everyone remained conscious of the fact that behind our backs and at our flanks, the Baltic offered the only escape to Germany. The sparse news from Germany became even more erratic. We no longer received deliveries of mail after the first days of March. It was necessary to rely on Wehrmacht reports as a source of information, and occasionally one would hear news of the situation in Germany, carefully couched in optimistic overtones, from the soldiers' program in Libau. Sometimes news briefs published on the front were shared. Finally, as we no longer fully trusted our own sources of information, small circles of friends would share what had been surreptitiously heard over the Swedish radio broadcasts. Through these bits and pieces of news, we remained informed of the continued massive air attacks of the Anglo-American Air Corps, as well as of the new Soviet offensive between the Oder and the Weichsel. Trapped in Kurland with weapons in hand, we could do nothing further to prevent the cataclysmic fate befalling our country. Despite the bitter news, which grew ever worse from day to day, the Courland army continued to hold their positions as ordered. Tie down enemy forces in the Baltic to lighten the task of defending the borders of the Reich. For those troops holding out in Courland, a special award was authorized in the form of a Courland cuff band. This band was manufactured in a small mill in Goldingen, and Latvian women were contracted to complete this last German war decoration by hand in small groups in their homes. The band was 38 millimeters in width and bore upon it an embroidered crest, the Teutonic Knights Order with the Balkan Cross against a silver-grey background, and the elk head, borrowed from the city seal of Mittau. Between the two crests were the stark black letters spelling Kurland. March and April passed with little activity. It was not until the 5th Battle of Courland that we again saw heavy action. We relieved the greatly weakened 126th Infantry Division in the area west and northwest of Prikuln, and this area on the Vartaya was to be our last stand until the day of capitulation. In the left sector before Bunker, the Red Army once again massed a large force to attack the German front and push through toward Libau. The assault suffered a severe defeat, and the Soviets withdrew under heavy fire from Nebelwerfer Regiment 70 and the Army Flak Battalion 276. The 14th Panzer Division, together with the 21st Luftwaffe Field Division, secured the sector, and the Soviets withdrew only after suffering heavy casualties, leaving large numbers of dead and wounded on the battlefield in front of the German positions. The Red Army did not appear to recover fully from the defeat in this sector, and after the 28th of February, the enemy no longer attempted to penetrate this limited area with a large-scale attack. Mid-March brought a thaw, reducing the streets and roads to little more than bottomless quagmires, over which nothing could travel without great exertion. The earthworks and machine gun positions seemed to be devoured by the grey-black mud, and even the activity on the Soviet side came almost to a halt, the impassable roads spoiling any immediate plans for a further attack. On the 18th of March, a short but heavy artillery barrage fell on our positions, as if to announce the opening of the last great battle of Courland. Units from the division were sent into action near Frauenburg and Schrunden, where they battled the Soviet attack until the offensive ground to a halt, the enemy tanks and support vehicles sinking in the swampy morass. The adverse conditions for the Lancers holding the line had become indescribable, and words cannot express the sacrifices and suffering of the troops during these final days. Following another breakthrough by the Soviet 8th Guards Division, the Russians were beaten back by the division on our left flank, situated to the south of Schrunden, the enemy suffering great losses. More than 500 prisoners, 263 tanks, 249 machine guns, 185 field guns, 29 mortars, and 27 aircraft were taken, exemplifying the determination of the Lancers to hold to the last. In mid-April, the 18th Army awaited another large-scale attack. The 1st Battalion of Regiment 438 was relieved at the front and assigned as reserve in preparation for the battle. The battle did not come. The enemy had begun placing all efforts and resources in the battle for Central Europe, and was no longer willing to continue sacrificing large numbers of troops against the stubborn German defences between Riga and Libau. Thus we were also compelled to wait. The front remained relatively quiet, but did not sleep. Our lines were penetrated constantly by Russian reconnaissance units, who exhibited great skill in their ability to slip past the thinly held positions, which still averaged 2 men per 100 metres of line to defend. These reconnaissance squads were invariably infiltrating and joining numerous secret partisan units in the rear areas, which displayed more activity as the weeks passed. On the Courland front, there was no rest, and simply to lie and sleep had become a foreign, unknown luxury as we struggled to survive. The grenadiers in the foremost positions hardly took notice that spring had arrived. On the evening of the 1st of May, 1945, we learned that Grofaz, the greatest warlord of all time, was dead. In general, news of the death of Hitler was received by the troops with indifference. However, it must also be said that some breathed a sigh of relief. During one of the nights shortly thereafter, a barrage broke forth from the enemy lines, and after a short pause we heard the raucous voice of a Russian propagandist blaring from a loudspeaker, "Berlin is ours!" Early the following morning, I observed in the dim light of the sunrise large letters of wood or cardboard impaled on posts spelling out "Russians in Berlin" at the edge of the woods 400 metres opposite us. Before dusk, a heavy machine gun crew opened fire on the offending message and hacked the sign to pieces. On the 5th of May, the battalion received instructions to send out a reconnaissance team to bring in prisoners in order to learn which unit lay opposite our positions. I selected several trusted lancers, and after nightfall we departed our lines. Before dawn we returned with 2 terrified Russians who were turned over to the division for interrogation. In carrying out this assignment, Kurt, my communicator, received the dubious distinction of having been the last member of the company to be wounded during the war. He was grazed across his shoulder by a bullet fired from a Soviet submachine gun, and the superficial wound required only a tetanus shot and bandage. He insisted on remaining with us in our forward positions, despite my efforts to send him to the rear. 8 May 1945 opened with brilliant sunshine. Throughout the previous days and weeks, remarkable rumours had consistently surfaced in the desperate hope that we would be spared. It was said that the Courland army was finally to be evacuated. Supposedly, the Western Allies were standing at rest on the Elbe River, and the remnants of the German Wehrmacht were reorganizing and massing to throw the Russians back over the old borders of the Reich and out of the heart of Europe. The Americans, the English, and the French had at last recognized that the Bolsheviks surging toward the west posed a threat to all of Europe. We were not to be betrayed and sold out to the Red Army after all. Other reports stated that the English and American fleets had been dispatched to evacuate the troops in Courland, and even that we were to join with the Americans, who were now engaged in open battle against the Russians on the Elbe. We were soon advised of another decision via reliable channels, and this devastating news served to extinguish any optimistic hopes of evacuation within the near future. British Field Marshal Montgomery had accepted the terms of surrender of Admiral von Friedberg in the North German zone, but these terms were to be valid only for the Western Front. The only hope remaining was that the Supreme Allied Commander, General Eisenhower, would also agree to such terms, and that it would be considered valid for the army in the eastern sectors. To do so would have served to extricate the long columns of refugees from the horror descending on them in the form of the Soviet army, as well as saving the troops still opposing the Soviets from the insufferable fate of languishing for years in gulags and prison camps. We belatedly received word that on the 1st of May, the commander of Army Group Courland, Generaloberst Hilpert, had released a status communiqué which passed verbally through the positions to the foremost lines. To continue pursuing the war in the West has lost all reason and has thus come to an end. The battle in the East is to continue with the same tenacity we have consistently displayed. The army commanders and the fatherland, though bleeding from many wounds, fully expect the Courland soldiers to fulfill their duty to the last. Officers and men must continue to have faith. The army group is later to be sent into action on the Elbe, and the evacuation plan for the Courland army continues to remain in effect. Our 132 Days Infantry Division held the battle sector to the west of Pré-Kulm in the southern part of the Courland front, approximately 30 kilometers from Libau. While we continued to repulse Russian troops probing the front lines, Behind us marched units of the 11th and 24th Infantry Divisions toward the harbour at Libau. Throughout the last 3 days, Kriegsmarine vessels of all types in Libau and Windau took on board as many personnel as possible. The naval commanders received a message via radio from the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht to Hela, Libau, Windau and Bornholm. From May 5th, 8 o'clock German summertime, a ceasefire with the opposing units of Field Marshal Montgomery will be in effect. All available transport at sea shall continue as ordered by the Kriegsmarine to save German personnel from the east. Do not engage, destroy or sink any vessels. Safety is paramount. On May 6th, the naval communicators on board ships received another message from the German Sea Command. To all ships in the Baltic, due to impending surrender, all sea and security forces, as well as freighters, must have left the harbours of Kurland and Hela no later than 0 o'clock, May 9, 1945. The transport of German citizens from the east shall be carried out with the highest priority. The German sailors of the Kriegsmarine attempted to save what little remained. The 5th Patrol Boat Flotilla fought a final sea battle against Russian motor torpedo boats and succeeded in sinking one of them. However, the die had been cast for our destiny. General Eisenhower would recognize the ceasefire on the Western Front only if the remaining German forces still opposing the Soviets in the east laid down their arms as well. The Allies possessed an immeasurable superiority in aircraft, armour and artillery, fully capable of destroying the remnants of the German forces. To end the resistance of the German units stubbornly holding out in Courland, the Russians had already transferred armoured regiments from Berlin against us. On May 7th, the commander of Army Group Courland sent a telegraph offer to surrender to the Russian command. The Soviets agreed only on the condition that the surrender be conducted by Hilpert in person. They wanted their victory to be as politically valuable as possible. Thus, the favoured general of the Courland fighters embarked on the difficult path of obeying his last orders to surrender his soldiers to an unspeakable fate. He would never again see Germany, perishing in 1946 behind the barbed wire of a Soviet prison camp. During the night of May 7-8, our division received the following order. To all forces, Marshal Govorov has agreed to a cease of hostilities beginning at 14 o'clock, May 8, 1945. All units are to heed this command immediately. White flags are to be displayed from all positions. Loyal obedience in the execution of this order is expected by the Supreme Commander of all troops. The fate of all personnel in Courland depends on strict adherence to this order. 2 days prior to the capitulation, each battalion was allowed to select 12 soldiers, fathers with many children, to be sent to the rear for transport to Germany. The chosen individuals reported in full marching equipment to the battalion headquarters to await their final assignment. Not a murmur was heard from those destined to remain behind. Throughout the ranks, discipline and a strong sense of comradeship prevailed until the end. 35. Aging Tante Ju-52 aircraft arrived directly from Norway to Courland to transport these men. As the soldiers boarded, the glittering fuselages lifted from the Grobin airfield, watched by those left behind with moist eyes. No one could have imagined the fate that awaited this last airlift from Courland. Shortly after departure, the planes were attacked by Russian fighters, resulting in the downing of 32 of the slow-moving, defenceless aircraft. They were the last planes of the German Luftwaffe, going down in flames with evacuees on board, finding their graves in foreign soil and the cold waters of the Baltic Sea. On May 8th, unsettling scenes unfolded at the loading docks in the harbours of Libau and Windau. Members of the 11th Infantry and the 14th Panzer Divisions boarded hastily assembled vessels of the 9th Kriegsmarine Security Flotilla. Sailors manning minesweepers, fishing boats, ferries and harbour cutters jettisoned excess equipment to make room for as many men as possible. The waiting soldiers exhibited an enduring display of iron discipline. Under the strafing fire of Russian fighters and amid bomb explosions, there were no complaints, no panic. As the ships reached dangerous levels of human cargo, naval officers halted the troops from boarding. Younger men voluntarily surrendered their places to enable older soldiers with families to be rescued. As the lines were cast off, the vessels slowly steamed toward the open Baltic. The commander of the 18th Army, General de Infanterie Boega, called to those departing Libau, "Greet the homeland for all the Courland fighters." With foaming bows, the ships ploughed against the high waves of the Baltic en route to western ports. Suddenly, Russian fighter bombers appeared and attacked the slow-moving vessels. During the initial assaults, some evacuees lost their lives to machine gun fire, and in strict obedience to orders, no shots were fired in defence. As the planes approached for a second attack, however, they encountered a barrage of defensive fire and turned away. 3 vessels transporting the 44th East Prussian Grenadier Regiment lagged behind and made port in Trelleborg. Despite Sweden's ostensible neutrality, these soldiers were later delivered to the Soviet Union. Some ships that departed Windau harbour were intercepted by Russian torpedo boats at sea. The leading ship, Rugard, turned to face the enemy vessels, allowing accompanying minesweepers to escape. The 1,300 men on board awaited the worst. The sailors of Rugard reassembled the breech block of the 88 mm deck gun. As the enemy craft closed in, the first shot was fired, hitting the leading Soviet boat and causing it to retreat, allowing Rugard to continue its journey. Thus ended the last sea battle in Europe, and more than 25,000 men of the Courland army made their way over the Baltic to German harbours in Holstein. In early May, the men in the foremost positions were unaware of events occurring behind the 132nd Infantry Division. They did not hear the last Wehrmacht report sent on May 9, 1945, which was to be the final official command from Germany. Our army group in Courland, which has successfully resisted overwhelming opposition for months, has demonstrated unmatched courage and endurance in 6 major battles. In the early morning hours, I stepped from the bunker of the 4th Heavy Machine Gun Company at the Vartaya streambed and blinked in the cool air of a new spring day. Nature began to show new growth, with bright green sprouts breaking through the dark soil, even from the saplings and bushes torn by shrapnel. I was startled from these thoughts by mortar rounds impacting nearby. Our company still had 6 heavy machine guns, 4 80 mm mortars, and 2 heavy 120 mm mortars on the front line, with no wounds reported since Kurt had been injured 2 days earlier. At the mortar position, situated 200 metres behind headquarters, we received isolated rifle fire from enemy positions. Using 2 heavy machine guns, I opened fire on the opposing tree line where most enemy activity was observed. The Russians responded with artillery. Our gunners returned fire. At approximately 0900, a band of fighters flew over the battalion positions and dropped bombs. Several fragmentation bombs exploded behind the mortar position without causing damage. The forward observers reported strong enemy movement in the hinterland of the opposite enemy rifle brigade. The communicators informed me that our land lines with the battalion were temporarily cut by shelling, so we prepared our weapons and waited for an attack. At exactly 12 o'clock, we received a radio report from the regiment that struck like lightning from the heavens. At 14 o'clock, the Courland army would capitulate. White flags were to be displayed along the front lines. All personnel were to remain in position under arms. Weapons were to be unloaded, magazines removed, and barrels cleared. Officers were to continue commanding their units. At 13 o'clock, I heard for the last time over the field telephone the voice of Hauptmann von Deimling, the regimental adjutant. He sharply instructed me not to act irrationally, to stop the shooting immediately, and to ensure that the capitulation order, which he repeated verbally, was carried out. He emphasized that strict compliance would determine the fate of the entire front sector. The news of the unconditional surrender raced throughout the ranks. For years we had been fighting desperately, burying our dead, and refusing to capitulate to a vicious enemy whom we still wholeheartedly opposed. I made rounds of our position, speaking to the men about the unknown fate that lay before us, and attempting to calm their nerves. We no longer feared death. We had lived with it for years. The prospect of finding a final resting place in an unmarked grave in Russia seemed inevitable. The real fear was of the unknown. What would become of us and our families in Germany? We were aware of the fate that had befallen thousands of Polish officers at Katyn, and we had no reason to expect anything different if we fell into enemy hands. The philosophy of fighting to the death had become ingrained in us. To surrender, as we were now ordered, felt inconceivable. The final moments. The silence on the front was broken by a distant pistol shot. Upon investigating, I discovered that one of our officers, upon hearing the capitulation order, had pulled his Luger pistol from the holster, laid it on his map case, and written, "Without an army there is no honour." He then calmly pressed the muzzle against his temple and squeezed the trigger. A company commander ran toward me, wildly waving his pistol and screaming, "I won't surrender." I ordered him to holster his weapon and return to his company, but he responded with threats. I drew my own pistol, and he disappeared into the undergrowth of the Vartaya streambed, still screaming, "No surrender! I refuse to surrender!" Later, I learned he had confronted the commander of a self-propelled gun, attempting to force the officer to advance with heavy weapons, all while shouting about our surrender. One of the soldiers eventually clubbed him with a rifle butt, and he fell unconscious. He did go into captivity, but remained a psychiatric case for the Russians. The enemy launched a final assault on our sister regiment, Infantry Regiment 436, on the last morning of the war in Europe. Uncle Sepp Drexel received the order for capitulation during the attack and had to persuade the battalion commander to cease fire. That afternoon, Oberst Drexel met with General Radionov, the Soviet division commander opposite his sector. The Russians, with massed artillery and an entire infantry division, made it clear to Drexel that our lines had been thinly defended. The Soviet intelligence officer, who had surveyed our positions weeks prior, expressed surprise at our defence. In the Soviet army, for every 3 men on the front line, 1 remained in the rear as support, while in the German army the opposite was true. The Russian officers were taken to General Dem for the official surrender of the division. On the evening of the 8th of May, the division assembled at headquarters before marching for many days to the prisoner assembly camp at Tel Shay. At 14 o'clock, our position was marked with ragged shirts, socks, and bandages on rifle barrels. With this sign of surrender, a khaki-brown wave surged from the forest's edge. The Russians swarmed into our positions, their new uniforms a striking contrast to our ragged appearance, thin from malnourishment and bleached pale from months in bunkers. They ignored our weapons and equipment, running among us, tearing decorations and insignia from uniforms. I ordered all personnel to assemble at the company command post, stationing a soldier approximately every 10 metres with an open assault rifle. This halted the Russians' plundering for the moment. A young Russian artillery lieutenant approached my headquarters. He was impeccably dressed, and from his appearance he could have been a German student. After exchanging salutes, he drew a map and asked about our artillery positions. I provided approximate information, and he expressed amazement at how far our batteries were positioned. As roving bands of Russian soldiers danced around us, singing, "Hitler kaputt! Wojna kaputt!" Our men stood in stony silence, reflecting bitterness and frustration. Eventually, the victors departed, and we received no further orders from the regiment. At approximately 15 o'clock, a pony cart arrived at our command post. Alone on the cart was a squat Soviet major with Oriental features. He approached me and offered a cigarette. I declined, but offered him a German Ep.9, which he accepted. I called for Lehmann, one of our soldiers who spoke fluent Russian, to serve as a translator. The major informed us we were to march across the lines to the Soviet positions, adding that officers would retain their sidearms for discipline. I explained that I could not comply, as my last orders were to remain in position. The major, after some contemplation, returned to his lines but reappeared shortly after, ordering me again to march the men across the lines. When I reiterated my refusal, he pulled his pistol and threatened to shoot me. Reluctantly, I gave the order for the men to form a column and marched the battalion forward. We proceeded several kilometres through the forest towards Prikuln, astonished by the overwhelming numbers of Russians. The forest was filled with T-34 tanks, and we passed Studebaker trucks parked bumper to bumper. As we marched, a column of T-34s camouflaged with tree branches approached us, and we stepped aside, passing Soviet tank crews who glared down at us. Finally, comma. We reached a small clearing where a Russian colonel had assembled his staff. In a half-circle stood the staff officers. Among them were a number of women wearing immaculate, tight-fitting uniforms, their eyes wide in amazement as they viewed us from under wide fur caps. The unfamiliar and long-forgotten smell of perfume wafted toward us. The column was brought to a halt, and I strode forward to formally surrender the 1st Battalion, 438th Regiment, to the enemy. After several long seconds of silence, I heard a low voice from the ranks of Soviet officers remark, "Kurosky discipline, Nonoga discipline, good discipline, much discipline." The colonel greeted me with a salute, followed by a handshake, something that I had not expected. He asked repeatedly, "Patshevu, why did you continue to fight? Hitler is long dead." I replied simply, "Because we are soldiers." I was then approached by a staff officer wearing the blue-piped cap of the NKVD, who inquired about the fate of the 2 Russians we had captured several days previously. I explained that they had been turned over to the regiment in good health, and he replied in broken German, "If not true, then—" and he slapped his holster threateningly. I was then asked if all weapons had been surrendered. I unbuckled my pistol belt and handed it to one of the officers, then turned and asked the men standing motionless in ranks if any arms were still carried. An NCO stepped forward and attempted to give a Russian officer a P-38 pistol, to which the officer responded, "Niet, niet," shaking his head vigorously. I then took the proffered weapon, removed the magazine, cleared the chamber and tossed it onto the roadside. It was explained to me that we would be treated correctly, and that we would soon be released and returned to our homes again. I clung desperately to these words with a glimmer of hope that perhaps the long nightmare was indeed coming to an end. I was then escorted a short distance from the column and invited to eat at a table piled high with food. I was amazed to see condiments of every description, including the cases of canned goods bearing the familiar label Oscar Mayer, Chicago. I politely refused the invitation, explaining that a German officer cannot eat unless the men are fed as well. The colonel appeared surprised at this response, and I was unceremoniously escorted back to the waiting column of prisoners. We were then assigned a mounted Cossack as an escort, and he repeatedly raced along the length of the column without a saddle at breakneck speed. Shortly after leaving the clearing, we were again descended upon by swarms of Russians who poured from the forest, tearing wedding rings, watches, and military decorations from the prisoners. I motioned for the Cossack, who galloped up to me and brought his mount to a sharp halt. I then removed my watch and offered it to him, explaining that he had been given responsibility to maintain order, and that, in violation of this order, the men were being plundered of personal belongings. He nodded grimly, and springing to the ground, he selected a stout stick from the forest's edge and leapt back on the horse. He then galloped headlong into the ranks of plundering Russians, wielding the stick like a sabre, swinging wildly at the mob, viciously striking them on their hands, arms, and backs until they retreated to the protection of the forest. As the sun was setting behind us, we were marched to a prisoner collection point in an old cemetery. As darkness descended, the Russians began to celebrate their final victory. Wildly firing over our heads with submachine guns, rifles, and pistols, they danced in the light of flares shot into the sky, while we were forced to lie flat on the ground to avoid being struck as tracer bullets bounced and ricocheted among the tombstones. The Soviets gathered around us, rejoicing in their victory with a macabre dance, chanting, "Hitler kaputt! Wojna kaputt!" in an unending chorus, leaping and springing in ecstasy while firing into the air. At dawn, the officers were separated from the enlisted men. The pain of defeat had begun. The heads of the soldiers were shorn, and the ranks formed into massive columns to be herded like cattle toward the east. Small groups of German soldiers captured earlier in the war appeared before us, representing the Antifa organization, the National Committee for Free Germany, and spoke of the benefits of communism. The presence and words of the collaborators were met with cold silence from the Courland veterans. After several hours, we were again on the march. After 3 days of steady marching, we received our first rations, a thin broth in which floated bits of cabbage leaves. This was only an indication of what our future would bring. The illusion of good treatment first assured us soon came to an end, as the rear echelon units did not recognize the fairness observed by soldiers at the front. The endless march along the primitive roads through swamps and forests had begun. The column moved painfully between heavily armed guards lining the roadsides, through the shroud of total defeat toward the east, to a final end of the war and to an unknown destiny. On the 8th of May 1945, the surviving soldiers of the Courland army marched into captivity. Thus began the final phase of the war, a struggle that proved to be vastly different from the battles we had previously experienced. A bitter fight for survival began, a battle for which there exists little defence. Herded together like cattle, we were first confined in open fields and forest clearings. As our hunger increased, we desperately attempted to draw nourishment from grass in the fields, and chewed bark from trees in attempts to stave off the gnawing pains of starvation that overwhelmed and weakened us.